People sometimes ask if they come to one of my retreats, will they have to participate in any kind of ceremonies or rituals? I've even had people ask, if I come to one of your retreats, will I have to bow to you? Well, I can tell you emphatically that you will not have to bow to me, unless you want to make me feel uncomfortable. But I can deal with that. That's just arising of self-referential fit. So if you want to test my practice and see how I can deal with being made to feel uncomfortable, then yes, you can bow to me. But otherwise, that would definitely not be a feature of my retreats. In fact, I am most happy if people look upon me as just like anybody else. Like somebody you could challenge or say, you know, you screwed up, or I disagree with you, and so forth. So no, you're not going to have to bow, and no, you're not going to have to do any kind of rites or rituals or ceremonies. Rites, rituals, ceremonies, we find them everywhere. We find them in our early beginnings, the tribal world. We find them in Christianity, particularly in the Catholic form or forms of Christianity. We find them everywhere. Historically, the Buddha, who lived approximately 2,500 years ago, seemed to be pretty down on rites and rituals, in the sense that he clearly stated that rites and rituals in and of themselves don't have any effect on the external world, and actually don't have any effect on our internal spiritual progress. The rites and rituals in and of themselves. And since in his culture, rites and rituals in and of themselves were considered to have a lot of effect and to be important, and people's religious life, spiritual life, often centered around these rituals, to deny the efficacy of rites and rituals was pretty damn revolutionary, and actually got a lot of pushback. So when we look historically at Buddhism, there would seem to be a negation of rites, rituals, ceremonies, and so forth. One of the things that the Buddha taught was to pay careful attention to your experience. And he said that if you pay careful attention to your experience, you will see that the nature of your experience is anicca, impermanent. And you will also realize that that's the nature of everything. Things change. One of the things that changes is Buddhism. It's a conditioned phenomenon. All conditioned phenomena change. That was the last words of the Buddha, anicca bhatta sankhara. All conditioned things change. Buddhism, as a cultural, historical phenomenon, is most assuredly a conditioned thing. It may point the path to something beyond conditions, but it itself is conditioned. And therefore, true to the Buddha's own teaching, Buddhism changed. Some people held to earlier forms of practice. Some people evolved new forms of practice. Some people held to earlier terminology and conceptual frameworks. Other people developed new terminology, new conceptual frameworks. Buddhism disappears from its native soil of India around the year 1200 AD. I mean, it was a long process, but if you want a sort of, to think in easy round numbers, you can think of Buddhist history as spanning on Indian soil approximately 1,700 years. There's the 500 years of the BC, and then there's about 1200 years of the AD. Fortunately, Buddhism, by the time it was wiped out in India, had been propagated throughout the rest of Asia, preserved, and now, in fact, has been reintroduced into India. During that 1700 years, changes took place. About 500 years after the Buddha's death, very, very roughly speaking. Once again, just to give you some simple whole number benchmarks, a reaction to early Buddhism arose that said it's not enough just to be liberated for your own liberation. It's equally important to contribute to the liberation and broadly the welfare of other people. Those two are on the same footing. So that's called Mahayana Buddhism. The Buddha's life exemplified that. He served, but his teachings tended to tell people you need to sort of like get yourself liberated. About 700 years after the Mahayana revolution started, the Vajrayana revolution started. So from, say, 700 AD to 1200 AD. There developed something called Vajrayana out of Mahayana. Vajrayana is known by a lot of different names, but we'll just use that one for now. What's interesting about Vajrayana is, relative to rites and rituals, it's at the other end of the spectrum. It's all about rites and rituals. So does this mean that Vajrayana is the ultimate degradation of the original teachings of the Buddha? Not at all. The Buddha said rites and rituals in and of themselves are not efficacious. But rites and rituals, if you wish, can create an ideal situation to develop concentration, sensory clarity, and equanimity. They can be vehicles for a meditative practice. So if you make it a vehicle for a meditative practice, you use the simplified situation, the repetitiveness, the symbolism, and so forth, then your rite and ritual can be a legitimate practice. There was a famous Kabbalistic master in Judaism who said, Judaism without kavanah is idolatry. Kavanah is the Hebrew word for high concentration, implying that if you just superficially do the Jewish liturgy, you might as well be worshiping idols. On the other hand, if you intentionally focus and use that environment to cultivate a certain state of consciousness, then it's a powerful practice. We don't use rites and rituals at my retreats, but we often will do a sweat lodge afterwards for those who wish to go back to a very ancient form of rite and ritual, one that most assuredly develops deep concentration, clarity, and equanimity.